Hello, everybody. Can you hear me?
Yes, doctor.
Okay. So let me start. So today we are going to talk about the anatomy of the diencephalon, and mainly within the diencephalon, we are going to talk about the neuroanatomy of the thalamus in detail. The rest of the parts of the diencephalon we are just going to introduce and show you where they are located. Hypothalamus we have already covered in detail in the endocrine block, so we are not going to deal with hypothalamus here. We are mainly in this session would be talking more about the neuroanatomy of the thalamus, the different nuclei of the thalamus, their connections. And then in the last part of today's lecture, we are going to talk about the internal capsule and the parts of the internal capsule and what are the different set of fibers which pass through the internal capsule. So we will begin our discussion today with, the parts of the diencephalon. And conventionally, diencephalon is divided into four parts. We have epithalamus, which includes the pineal gland and nearby structures. We have the thalamus, we have the subthalamus, and we have the hypothalamus. So mainly our discussion today would be on thalamus. The rest of the parts of the diencephalon will just show you where they are located in the brain and some minor details about epithalamus and subthalamus. But mainly our focus of discussion today would be thalamus. So if you look at the sagittal section of the brain, this is the part which we are talking about. So this is the hypothalamus, this is the thalamus, and this is the epithalamus. So this part is epithalamus, this is thalamus, this is hypothalamus, and subthalamus lies between the midbrain and the thalamus. So it cannot be seen in a sagittal section. It is more conveniently seen in a coronal section. If we make a coronal section through the thalamus here, we would probably be able to see the subthalamus. But in this section, the sagittal section of the brain, you are seeing the hypothalamus here. This is the hypothalamic sulcus here. Above that is the thalamus, and this area is the epithalamus. So we'll start our discussion with the epithalamus, which constitutes the pineal gland here. This cone-shaped gland, which you see here, is the pineal gland. And some nearby structures, gray matter structures, are also included in the epithalamus. So the pineal gland, as we said, is a midline unpaired structure, just rostral to the superior colliculus of the midbrain. It resembles the pine cone in shape, and hence its name is pineal gland. The pineal gland consists of pinealocytes, which are the collection of the secretory cells, and some glial cells which are rich in vascular network, and it is also connected with the pathway which is responsible for vision. So the hormones which are secreted by the pineal gland are under the regulation of circadian rhythm or the day-night cycle. So the hormone which the pineal gland secrete is the melatonin, which is the anti-gonadotropic hormone. So when you have daylight times increasing or day lengths increasing, there is, because it is the melatonin is, which is an anti-gonadotropic hormone, is released in high rates during darkness. So the gonadal function is going to increase when you have longer day times. So you would see that in places like Saudi Arabia and other places where you have longer daytime or sunlight is available for longer period of time. the puberty happens earlier because melatonin is, highly secreted during darkness. So the places where you have shorter daytime, you would have puberty coming up later. So melatonin, besides it gives pigmentation to the skin, melatonin also have an anti-gonadotropic functions. That's why when you have longer day lengths, you probably might also have earlier puberty because there is increased gonadal function. The other piece of the epithalamus is habenula, which is, small swellings on each side of the stalk of the pineal gland. So if you see the stalk of the pineal gland, on each side of it, there is a small swelling, which is made up of habenular nuclei, and there are two habenular nuclei, right and left. They are connected by a commissure, which is called the habenular commissure. Each habenular nuclei receives one major input, which is sorry. Each habenular nuclei receives one major input, which is the striamedullaris thalami. It is basically an input which is coming from the thalamus through striamedullaris thalami, and the output from the habenular nucleus goes to the interpeduncular area. So, yeah, in the interpeduncular. I think somebody is not mute. Please mute yourself so that you don't disturb others. So what you are seeing is that habenula has one major input, which is the striamedullaris thalami, and it has one major output, which is going to the interpeduncular nuclei, which is between the two cerebral peduncles. So that is the habenulo interpeduncular tract, which connects the output of the habenula to the interpeduncular nuclei. Uh, this is, as I said, that interpeduncular nuclei are located between the two cerebral peduncles in the reticular formation of the rostral part of the midbrain. The subthalamus, which is the other part of the diencephalon. So in the epithalamus we have talked about the pineal gland and the habenular nuclei. The other part of the diencephalon is the subthalamus, which is basically the extension of the rostral part of the tegmentum of the midbrain. So if you just go above the tegmentum of the midbrain, below the thalamus, you are basically reaching the subthalamus. So the midbrain tegmentum continues into diencephalon as subthalamus. So its location is inferior to the thalamus and lateral to the hypothalamus. So it is lower than thalamus and it is lateral to the hypothalamus and it is medial to the internal capsule. It is traversed by the somatosensory pathways which are going to the thalamus and several pathways which are involving the cerebellum and basal ganglia. So if you try to imagine where subthalamus is located, subthalamus is basically an extension of the tegmentum of the midbrain up, and it is lying just below the thalamus, and it is lying lateral to the hypothalamus and medial to the internal capsule. The subthalamus contains nuclei, which are called the subthalamic nuclei. These are lens-shaped biconvex structures, which you see within the subthalamus, located medial and superior to the portions of the basal pedunculi and the internal capsule, and they are connected with basal ganglia. So what you are seeing here is this portion which we are talking about the as subthalamus. This is the thalamus, and this is a coronal section. So you have taken a coronal section from there, and now you're looking at this place just below the thalamus. So if you see, this is the thalamus, and this is the area which we are talking about as subthalamus. You can see the substantia nigra here. So this is the midbrain, where you are seeing the substantia nigra. Just above it, below the thalamus, medial to the internal capsule. So this is the internal capsule, and you're seeing medial to it is this area, which is the subthalamus. Again, in this diagram also it is very clear. You can see the thalamus here. This is the internal capsule. This is the substantia nigra. So just above the substantia nigra, below the thalamus, this is the area which we are talking about, which is the subthalamic nuclei. Now we are coming to the thalamus, and that's the major part of this session. You need to focus on hypothalamus. As I said, we are not going to cover here because it has been covered mainly in the endocrine block, where it has been the major function of the hypothalamus is with the hormones, and that has been studied. The nuclei of hypothalamus have been studied in the endocrine block. So we are going to talk about the thalamus. So thalamus has four basic functional roles. You know that all sensory information except olfaction. So besides the sense of smell, all sensory information, your general somatic sensations, your general visceral sensation, special visceral, special somatic information, all these senses or sensory information must first relay to the thalamus before they go to the cortex. Uh, the motor outputs from basal ganglia and cerebellum are also related to the thalamus, and then from thalamus to the motor cortex. So the all sensory information goes to the thalamus, and then it is relayed to the sensory cortex. All information, motor information, which is arising from basal ganglia and sorry, basal ganglia and cerebellum, they first go to thalamus, and then from thalamus they are relayed to the motor cortex. Thalamus is also involved in emotion and memory. So thalamus is a part of the Pappas circuit, which we are going to talk about next week when we are talking about the limbic system. So it helps in control of emotion and memory through the limbic cortex. So there are connection between thalamus and the limbic system or the limbic cortex, which help in emotion and memory. Then you have some vegetative functions of the thalamus, which are, wakefulness and arousal. That is, alertness and arousal is also controlled by thalamus, because thalamus has projections to all parts of the cerebral cortex. So the reticular formation has connections with some intrinsic nuclei of the thalamus, and thalamus in turn has connections with all parts of the cortex. So the vegetative functions of arousal and alertness are also partly the functions of the thalamus. So these are the four major group of functions which you would see with thalamus. Thalamus doesn't just send information to the cortex, it receives cortical feedback. This signal helps regulate what is coming to the cortex, and cortical input is the feedback inhibition loop, letting the thalamus know that the information has been received and inhibiting further relay of information. So there is, two-way communication between the cortex and the thalamus. Once the information is received, there would be inhibitory signals coming from the cortex to the thalamus so that further information is not sent to the cortex. Now, if we look at the thalamus, it looks like a egg, and this egg is divided into three parts by a Y-shaped, thin myelinated fibers, and these are three parts are anterior, medial, and lateral. And within the lateral, you would find a dorsal part and a ventral part. And within these parts, you are going to see different nuclei of the thalamus. So if we see here, this is a thalamus, which is more of shape of an egg. And these are the white matter bundles or interlaminary fibers, which are dividing the thalamus into three basic parts: the anterior, the medial, and lateral. And then what you would see is the ventral part, which is lying over the hypothalamus. So that's why this is the ventral part, and this, the top part of the thalamus is called the dorsal part. So you have a dorsal part, you have a ventral part, you have an anterior part, and you have a medial part and a lateral part. So if you see the nuclei within these three parts of the thalamus, you would find out there is a dorsomedial nucleus because it's on the dorsal surface. There's an anterior nucleus in the anterior part of the thalamus. And then because this part, the lateral part, is more ventrally related, or it is lying over the top of the hypothalamus, it is called it is further divided into three parts: ventroanterior, ventrolateral, and ventroposterior lateral, and ventroposterior medial. So the ventroposterior part is further divided into ventroposterior lateral and ventroposterior medial nucleus. So you have a dorsomedial nucleus, you have an anterior nucleus, you have a ventroanterior nucleus, ventrolateral nucleus, ventroposterior lateral nucleus, and ventroposterior medial nucleus. In addition, this posterior part of the thalamus, which is overhanging, it is called the pulvinar. And along the pulvinar, on the medial side, you would find medial geniculate body, and on the lateral side, you would find the lateral geniculate body. So these are the main nuclei or nuclear group or gray matter groups which you are going to find in the thalamus. So first, what you need to understand is that thalamus is like an egg shape. It has a ventral surface and it has a dorsal surface, which is the upper surface is called dorsal. The ventral surface is the one which is lying over the hypothalamus. These interlaminary white matter bundles are, or white matter fibers, are going to divide the thalamus into an anterior part, medial part, and the lateral part. And the lateral part is further divided into a ventral part and a dorsal part. So there is a ventroanterior and ventral part of the lateral part and a dorsal part of the lateral part. The posterior part is overhanging the membrane, which is called the pulvinar. And at the pulvinar, you would find there is a medial geniculate body, and there is also another group which is called the lateral geniculate body. Within the medial group, there is one nucleus, which is called the dorsomedial nucleus. Within the anterior part of the thalamus, there is one nucleus, which is called the anterior nucleus of the thalamus. Within the ventroanterior part, you have three divisions or three nuclei: ventroanterior, ventrolateral, and ventroposterior is further divided into ventroposterior lateral and ventroposterior medial nucleus. And then you have pulvinar as a gray matter and medial geniculate body as a gray matter attached to the thalamus. And then you have lateral geniculate body, also a part of the thalamus, which has connections. So in total, and then there are within this white matter bundle, Y-shaped interlaminary nuclei, which are basically present, scattered between this white matter, which are called interlaminary nuclei. Now, if we see the connections, we will start with the dorsomedial nucleus, which is on the medial side. You would find that it has two-way connections with the prefrontal cortex, and it is receiving the information from the amygdala, the temporal neocortex, and substantia nigra. This is dorsomedial nucleus is mainly related with cognition because it is related with prefrontal cortex. Then we have the connections in the anterior nucleus, which the incoming is through the mammillothalamic tract and outgoing is going to the cingulate gyrus. Again, this anterior nucleus is mainly related with the limbic system. So dorsomedial nucleus, you have two-way connections with the prefrontal cortex from the amygdala and temporal cortex. In the anterior nucleus, you have the incoming tract, which is the mammillothalamic, outgoing the cingulate gyrus. So this anterior nucleus is mainly related with the limbic system. Then we come to the ventroanterior nucleus. This ventroanterior nucleus is mainly receiving inputs from the basal ganglia. So you would see globus pallidus and substantia nigra reticulata are basically giving the inputs. The output is going to go to the premotor cortex, mainly the area number 6. The ventrolateral nucleus has both connections with the basal ganglia as well as from cerebellum. The output is going to go to the motor cortex. So ventroanterior is purely connection between basal ganglia and the thalamus, and the output is going to the motor cortex, while ventrolateral nucleus is connection between cerebellum and the thalamus, and then output is going to the motor cortex. It also has connections coming from basal ganglia and going to the motor cortex. Ventro-posterior lateral nucleus is receiving medial lemniscus and spinothalamic tracts or spinal lemniscus, which are basically bringing two-touch discrimination, vibration, pressure, all these general sensations from the body to the ventro-posterior lateral nucleus. The output from here is going to go to area 312, which is the primary somatosensory area. So you will see areas 312 in the cortex where the output from the ventroposterior lateral nucleus is going. So that is mainly responsible for with the primary somatosensory area. Then you have the ventroposterior medial nucleus, which is receiving the trigeminothalamic tracts and the taste fibers, and the output again is going to go to the primary somatosensory area. Now, you are looking at the the lateral geniculate body, which is receiving the optic tract, and the output is through the optic radiation going to the primary visual area, which is the area 17. The medial geniculate body is mainly related with the auditory system, so it is receiving the fibers from the inferior colliculus and the lateral lemniscus, and the output is going to go to area 41 and 42, which is in the temporal lobe, and it is the primary auditory area. The pulvinar is receiving, bilateral information. Its input and output is going from area 18 and 19, and the inferior parietal lobe. These are the association cortexes. So you have there is a two-way connection between the association cortices and the pulvinar. So it is very important in terms of the understanding of sensory input, because the connections between pulvinar is with the association cortices. So this is again showing you the parts. You can see this is the interlaminar fibers, which are dividing the thalamus into anterior, lateral, and medial part. Within these parts, you can see dorsomedial nucleus here, the anterior nucleus here. The lateral portion is divided into a ventral part and a dorsal part. And then the posterior part has pulvinar, lateral geniculate body, and the medial geniculate body or nucleus. To look at the nuclei, there is an anterior nucleus, dorsomedial nucleus. In the lateral portion, the ventral part has ventroanterior, ventrolateral, ventroposterior medial, ventroposterior lateral. The posterior part has pulvinar, lateral geniculate body, medial geniculate body, and the dorsal part of the lateral part of the thalamus has lateral dorsal and lateral posterior nuclei. We go by each one of them. The anterior nucleus, as we said, receives the mammillothalamic tract. The output is to the cingulate gyrus, which is the part of the limbic system. Dorsomedial nucleus receives the fibers from amygdala, hypothalamus, and olfactory cortex. The output is going to go to the prefrontal cortex. The ventroanterior is mainly receiving the fibers from the basal ganglia, so globus pallidus and substantia nigra reticulata. Output is going to go to premotor and prefrontal cortex. Ventrolateral would receive both from cerebellum, dentate nucleus, and also from globus pallidus and substantia nigra. The output is going to go to primary motor cortex and the supplementary motor cortex. The lateral dorsal nucleus is sending information to the cingulate gyrus. The lateral posterior nucleus has two-way connections with the superior parietal cortex. The ventroposterior lateral nucleus, we said, it receives the medial lemniscus and the spinothalamic tract, and the output is going to go to the sensory cortex. Ventroposterior-medial nucleus receives the trigeminothalamic and solitary nucleus, tractus solitarius, and output goes to the sensory cortex. The lateral geniculate body receives the optic tract, and the output goes to the visual cortex, the primary visual cortex with the area 17. Medial geniculate nucleus receives the input from the inferior colliculus and from the lateral lemniscus, and the output is going to go to the auditory, primary auditory cortex. The pulvinar receives the information from lateral geniculate nucleus, superior colliculus, and the output is going to go to all association cortices. The areas of temporal, occipital, parietal lobes, these are all receiving inputs in the pulvinar. Now, if you have a problem with the dorsomedial nucleus of the thalamus, and it usually happens in alcoholics where you have Wernicke's-Korsakoff syndrome, and because it is sending information to the prefrontal cortex, you can see here the loss of memory is one of the issues which you are going to see with the degeneration of the dorsomedial nucleus of the thalamus, and the condition is called Wernicke's-Korsakoff syndrome. If you have a problem with the pulvinar because it is projecting into all the association cortices, you may have sensory aphasia. If you have a problem with the VPL, you would lose the sensory input on the contralateral side of the body, which are spinothalamic and the medial lemniscus. And if you have a problem with the VPM, then you have a problem with the pain and temperature on the face as well as the taste sensations. Lateral geniculate body, if it is damaged, then you have left homonomous heminopia. So these are some of the things which can happen because of the damage to different nuclei of the thalamus. Now there are some functional divisions, as we said. There are some specific relay nuclei, for example, sensory nuclei. We have talked about VPL and VPM and the geniculate nuclei. Then we have some motor relay nuclei from the cerebellum and basal ganglia, which are ventroanterior and ventrolateral. And then association nuclei, which are dorsomedial nucleus, pulvinar. So these are mainly association nuclei. These are just giving you the names again. And then there are some others besides medial and lateral geniculate nuclei, the interlaminar nuclei and the reticular nuclei, which are present between the lamina, the white matter lamina, which divides the thalamus. You have some interlaminar nuclei there. So those are important in arousal and wakefulness. The blood supply to the thalamus mainly is by posterior cerebral and posterior communicating artery, but some part of the thalamus is also supplied by the anterior choroidal artery. So the major supply is by posterior cerebral and the posterior communicating artery, but then you have some contribution from the anterior choroidal artery, which is also supplying the thalamus. So the thing which you are going to see with the thalamus is the thalamic stroke, one of the things which you are going to see with thalamic stroke is loss of consciousness, arousal, attention arousal problems, widespread disruption of cortical functions, because you can see the thalamus has two-way connections with the cortex. But one of the characteristic signs of the thalamic stroke is that you have intense, intractable pain in the legs. So you start to have some intractable pain, which you cannot trace out from where this pain is coming. So in one of the characteristic signs of a thalamic stroke, besides being unconscious and in comatose place, once you recover, you somehow have some intractable pain in the lower limbs because of the thalamic stroke. So that is also one of the characteristics of the thalamic strokes. This is a table which is giving you details about major inputs and outputs from the thalamus and what is their function. So you can, it's just a summary of what I've already said. What is the function of the lateral geniculate body, which is the major input and output. The major ones which you should remember, I don't expect you to remember everything, but you should remember the lateral and medial geniculate body. You should remember ventroposterior lateral and ventroposterior medial nucleus, their inputs and outputs. In terms of the diseases, Wernicke's-Korsakoff syndrome occurs because of the degeneration in the dorsomedial nucleus, and even the pathologists are going to talk about the Wernicke's-Korsakoff, and they will tell you about the degeneration of the dorsomedial nucleus in the thalamus. So that's why you need to know about the dorsomedial nucleus and what happens because of that. And then lateral and medial geniculate body and ventroposterior lateral and ventroposterior medial nuclei. These are the most important. Others, if you do not know the full connections, doesn't matter, but you know now because you have done the cerebellum and basal ganglia that the outputs from the basal ganglia and cerebellum do not go directly to the cortex. They relay in certain nuclei of the thalamus. So their understanding the ventroanterior and ventrolateral nuclei is just for your understanding. But these four on the top, you must know. And you must know about the dorsomedial nucleus. That degeneration in alcoholics of the dorsomedial nucleus can lead to Wernicke's-Korsakoff syndrome. So we are coming now to the internal capsule. The internal capsule is the white matter bundle which lies between the thalamus and the basal ganglia, parts of the basal ganglia, the globus pallidus and putamen, so and caudate. So that white matter bundle which you see between the thalamus and the parts of the basal ganglia is called the internal capsule. So the thalamocortical and corticothalamic fibers, the corticopontine, the corticobulbar fibers, they all have to pass through the internal capsule before they reach the cerebral peduncles in the midbrain. The fibers projecting from the cerebral cortex to the various nuclei of the extrapyramidal system like putamen and caudate, they also have to pass through the internal capsule. So there are 5 parts of the internal capsule. One is the anterior limb, then you have the genu, then you have the posterior limb, that you have the retrolentiform part and the sublentiform part. If you remember, we said there is the head of caudate. Let me open up. I think I can stop sharing here. Let me open up a cross section so that you can show. Open up this. Can you see this slide now? Hello?
Yes, doctor, we can see the slide.
You can see the slide?
Yeah, the one shows the brain with the thalamus.
Okay. So this slide is, if we see the internal capsule here, we can easily make out the internal capsule. This white matter bundle, which we are seeing here, is the internal capsule. So you have a part of the internal capsule which lies between the head of caudate and the lentiform nucleus. So this is the lentiform nucleus and this is the head of caudate. Between that, this bundle of fibers is the anterior limb of the internal capsule. And this area, which is lying between the thalamus and the lentiform nucleus, is the posterior limb. The two limbs are joining at this point, which is called the genu. Then you have these bundles of fibers which are going to the occipital lobes, which are behind the lentiform nucleus, and this is called the retrolentiform part of the internal capsule. So you have anterior limb, genu, posterior limb, and this part of it is the retrolentiform part of the internal capsule. Then there is one part which you are not seeing in this horizontal section, because the fibers are going to pass below the lentiform nucleus to the temporal lobe. So they are going to arch like this, pass below the lentiform nucleus and then go to the temporal lobe. Those are called the sublentiform part of the internal capsule. So if you see here, you would find that there is the anterior limb, genu, posterior limb, and then you have the retrolentiform part here, which is lying behind the lentiform nucleus and going to the occipital cortex. And there is a part which is passing below the lentiform nucleus and then arch over the lentiform nucleus to enter the temporal lobe, which is called the sublentiform part of the internal capsule. So let me go back again to my initial presentation and see if we can share that. Okay, so we go back here and we see what we are talking about. There are 5 parts of the internal capsule. One is the anterior limb, which we showed you that it is the part between the head of chordate and the lentiform nucleus. Then you have the posterior limb, which is between thalamus and the lentiform nucleus, and where the two parts are joining is called the genu. And then behind the lentiform nucleus, you have the retrolentiform part, and the part which is passing below the white matter bundle, which is passing below the lentiform nucleus and going to the auditory cortex, is called the sublenticular part. Now, anterior limb of the internal capsule has mainly the anterior thalamic radiation. What are the origin from the which nuclei they are originating? These fibers are originating from the anterior and the dorsomedial nucleus of the thalamus. Where they are going? They are going to the cingulate gyrus and prefrontal gyrus. So from the anterior nucleus and the dorsomedial nucleus, the fibers of the from the thalamus are originating. They are passing through the anterior limb of the internal capsule and they are reaching to the cingulate gyrus and prefrontal gyrus. In the genu, mainly the fibers are coming from the ventro-anterior and ventrolateral nucleus of the thalamus. And we know that these fibers are coming from basal ganglia to thalamus and from thalamus to premotor cortex and primary motor cortex. In the posterior limb of the internal capsule, you have the corticospinal and corticonuclear fibers descending, and you have fibers from the medial lemniscus which have relayed into the ventroposterior medial nucleus, and the spinal lemniscus which has relayed into the medial lemniscus and spinal lemniscus which have relayed into the ventroposterior lateral nucleus, and trigeminal lemniscus and the nucleus solitarius or tractus solitarius, which has relayed into ventroposterior medial nucleus of the thalamus. From there, the fibers are going to go to the somatosensory cortex. So you have both motor fibers here and the somatosensory fibers, which are present in the posterior limb of the internal capsule. That's why it is very important to know the posterior limb. If you have posterior limb of the internal capsule damaged, you would have whole half side of the body, including the face, which will lose sensations and would have spastic type of paralysis. So this is the only place in it's the only place where you have, if you have damage the posterior limb, you would have complete half side of the body on the opposite side would have spastic type of paralysis, and you would lose all sensory information except the forehead muscles, because the forehead muscles are bilaterally supplied. The corticonuclear fibers, which are descending to the facial nucleus, are bilaterally supplying the forehead fibers. So if one side of the internal capsule is affected, posterior limb of the internal capsule, whole half side of the body would present with spastic type of paralysis, and whole half side of the body would lose all sensations, because you can see all motor pathways, all sensory pathways are passing through the posterior limb of internal capsule. Origin of the motor pathways are from the motor cortex, the corticospinal tract, and the corticonuclear fibers. The sensory pathways are coming from VPL and VPM, so ventroposterolateral nucleus and ventroposterior medial nucleus. Motor pathways are descending down, going to the corticospinal fibers are going to the spinal cord. Corticonuclear fibers are going to go to the brainstem. Somatosensory fibers, which are coming from VPL and VPM, they are going to go to the primary somatosensory cortex, which is the area 312. The retrolentiform fibers are mainly related with optic radiation. So you are basically seeing optic radiation and the association relay, which is coming from the pulvinar. So the retrolentiform part has the fibers which will originate from either pulvinar, or they would originate from the lateral geniculate nucleus. If they are originating from pulvinar, they are going to go to all association cortices. The parietal association cortex, the temporal association cortex, and occipital association cortex. While if they are originating from the lateral geniculate body, the optic tracts are coming and ending into the lateral geniculate body, and then they are going to go to the primary visual cortex, which is the area 17. The sublentiform part is mainly associated with auditory radiation, but it also has some part of the optic pathway. So if you are seeing some in the sublentiform part, the fibers from the lateral geniculate nucleus, they are going to the visual cortex. If you're seeing the fibers of the auditory radiation, they are coming from the medial geniculate nucleus and going to go to the auditory cortex. The blood supply of the internal capsule is also important. You need to see that there are three major arteries which are supplying the internal capsule. At least two are very important for you to remember. One is this area of the internal capsule, which is the genu and the anterior limb, which is mainly supplied by the penetrating branches of the middle cerebral, and they are called the lateral striate artery. So lateral striate arteries are the penetrating branches of the middle cerebral, which supply the anterior limb, the genu, and the anterior part of the posterior limb. And then the other part of the posterior limb and the retrolentiform part of the internal capsule are mainly supplied by the anterior choroidal artery. And if you go to the visual cortex here, there would be the posterior cerebral contribution. But main two arteries which you should remember about the internal capsule is the penetrating branches of the middle cerebral, which are the lateral striate arteries, and the anterior choroidal artery, which contribute in the blood supply of the internal capsule. Thank you very much. If you have any questions, I am happy to answer. Let's see what is there on the chat. So we have Habinullah, we don't know what is the function. It is partly part of the limbic system. So it is, that's how you should remember about it, that it is part of the limbic system. And limbic system is involved in both our cognitive functions as well as in behavior and emotions. On the side of the pineal gland, on the side of the pineal gland, on the top, the stalk, where you would see the stalk of the pineal gland, you would find right and left sides. So you have habenular nucleus on the side of the stalk of the pineal gland. Doctor mentioned cingulate cortex in the end along the pathway. On the ventral side, we have ventroanterior, ventrolateral, and ventroposterior nucleus, and ventroposterior is further divided into ventroposterior lateral and ventroposterior medial. Which brain spastic paralysis will be if you have the internal capsule affected. You know that the corticospinal tract is going uh, to to cross at the level of lower level of medulla. So you would have spastic paralysis on the contralateral side. Loss of sensations would be also on the contralateral side because there would be crossing of the spinal lemniscus and medial lemniscus, which have already been crossed before they reach the thalamus or the internal capsule. The contralateral paralysis of the face, yes, there would be contralateral paralysis of the face, but sparing the forehead because this is an upper motor neuron type of lesion. Isn't anterior limb by anterior cerebral artery and posterior limb by the medial cerebral artery? Uh, the anterior cerebral artery does not supply the internal capsule. It's mainly the lateral striate arteries, which are the penetrating branches of the middle cerebral, which will supply the anterior part of the internal capsule, the anterior limb, the genio, and anterior part of the posterior limb. The rest of the posterior limb would be by the anterior choroidal artery. Doctor, for retrolentiform part, the sublentiform, can you please tell us what is the difference? So the retrolentiform part is the part which is behind the lentiform nucleus, which I showed you. If I can share the screen again, let me show you and show. So let me stop sharing. So can you see the screen again? You see
Yes, doctor.
this part of the so let me annotate also spotlight. So this part of white matter which you are seeing below, this is the lentiform nucleus. So just behind the lentiform nucleus, the fibers which are going to the cortex, these fibers are retrolentiform part of the internal capsule. This white matter bundle, this is the retrolentiform part because it is behind the lentiform nucleus. The sublentiform part you cannot see here because they are going to pass below the lentiform nucleus. This is the lentiform nucleus. Below that, there would be sublentiform part which is passing below the lentiform nucleus and then going into the temporal cortex. So that is the sublentiform part of the internal capsule. Let me go to the chart again. Okay. Posterior limb damage spares the forehead, tongue, and eyes. Yeah, it can happen because you would have certain part of the corticospinal fibers or corticonuclear fibers, we must say. Corticonuclear fibers, part of it, they are passing through the genio of the internal capsule rather than the posterior limb. Yes, doctor, what is the difference in their supply? So as we said, genio and the anterior part of the posterior limb is supplied by the lateral geniculate branches of the like lateral striate branches of the middle cerebral, and the posterior part of it is supplied by the anterior choroidal artery. And Dr. Akif took the anterior. I'm just showing you, you can see this picture. I'm just going to show you the blood supply picture and you can make out from this. This is from high yield neuroanatomy, which I've took this picture. Can you see this blood supply picture? Can you see this blood supply picture now, you guys?
Yes, doctor.
Yes.
Okay. So you see, this is the area of the, let me spotlight. This is the area of the anterior cerebral. And then you are seeing, this is the area of the middle cerebral. And this white area which you are seeing is the area for the penetrating branches of the middle cerebral. And if you see, this is the basal ganglia, this is the head of caudate. So this is the anterior limb. Okay. So you are seeing that this is supplied by penetrating branches of middle cerebral, which is the anterior, which is the lateral striate arteries. Now, when you see the posterior limb of the internal capsule, this is the posterior limb of the posterior part of the posterior limb. This is supplied by anterior choroidal artery. You would see that anterior cerebral is supplying here in the midline. So it is far away from the the anterior limb of the internal capsule. That's what my assumption is, but we can check again. This is the reference which I'm putting up is from the high yield neuroanatomy. Is it clear? So posterior limb will be supplied by anterior choroidal, most of the posterior limb, but the anterior part of the posterior limb is going to be supplied by the striate arteries from the middle cerebral. So the major artery which you must not forget for the internal capsule is the penetrating branches of the middle cerebral, which is the striate branches of the lenticustriate branches of the middle cerebral. Doctor, for the retrolentiform part and sublentiform part, give the same information. For retrolentiform part, definitely anterior choroidal is going to supply there. Anything else? Okay, thank you very much. Let's stop here. If you have any questions, you can email me later.